Hello and welcome to the BRICS News, your ultimate source for unfiltered geopolitical insights, global economic trends, and breaking news from the BRICS Plus alliance. The world is changing fast, and the balance of power is shifting away from the West. As BRICS Plus nations rise, Europe weakens, the United States recalibrates its alliances, and a new multipolar world order takes shape. Today, we bring you an in-depth analysis of how the United States is abandoning Europe, strengthening ties with Russia, China, and the Middle East, and what this means for the future of global politics. If you're ready to stay ahead of the curve and understand the forces reshaping our world, make sure to like this video to support independent analysis. Share it with others who need to know the truth. Subscribe to the BRICS News for real-time updates. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a critical update. Now let's dive deep into today's game-changing revelations. For centuries, Europe positioned itself as the powerhouse of the world, leading colonial conquests, influencing global economies, and dictating political ideologies. However, the tides of history are changing. The United States, once Europe's greatest ally, is now actively sidelining it, prioritizing relations with Russia, China, and the Middle East instead. The signs of this shift are clear. Washington has completely ignored Europe's interests in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. China, despite being America's so-called rival, remains a massive United States investment hub. Trump's administration is leaning toward Russia while treating NATO as a liability. The Middle East is now Washington's key strategic partner, sidelining Europe entirely. The BRICS Plus alliance is strengthening, with the United States showing indirect support by abandoning its old European allies. This shift marks a historic turning point where the Western world, once united under the United States-Europe-NATO umbrella, is fracturing irreversibly. The European Union and NATO, once seen as invincible, are now weak, isolated, and struggling to remain relevant. Let's dive deep into how Europe has fallen from grace and why the United States is now looking toward Russia, China, and BRICS, plus for its future global partnerships. For decades, Europe blindly followed American foreign policy, believing that Washington would always protect its interests. During the Cold War, NATO was seen as a security blanket against Soviet influence. In the post-Cold War era, Europe continued to act as an obedient ally in America's wars, like Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. Even after Trump openly mocked NATO and threatened to leave it, European leaders still remained submissive. But this relationship was never about mutual respect. It was a hierarchical one, where America dictated the rules and Europe obeyed. Now America has outgrown this alliance, realizing that Europe is more of a liability than an asset. The Biden administration, and more notably, Trump's incoming foreign policy advisors, have made it clear Europe is weak, unimportant, and incapable of making independent strategic decisions. The United States sees no benefit in prioritizing NATO, as Europe cannot even defend itself without American support. America's military-industrial complex is more interested in Middle Eastern and Asian affairs than European security. This abandonment is now evident in Ukraine, where America has started direct peace talks with Russia, completely sidelining both Ukraine and Europe. Europe, despite having suffered economically due to sanctions against Russia, is not even invited to these negotiations. The message is clear: Europe does not matter. Under Trump's leadership, America's approach to Russia is undergoing a drastic transformation. Trump has long admired Putin, calling him a strong leader and suggesting that the United States should work with Russia rather than against it. The military-industrial complex in the United States is realizing that prolonged war with Russia is financially unsustainable. America is now more interested in containing China than fighting Russia, making peace with Moscow a strategic necessity. This new United States-Russia dynamic is terrifying Europe, as it threatens to leave the entire continent exposed to Russian influence. For decades, Europe justified its existence as America's loyal ally against Russian aggression. Now, with Trump seeking peace with Putin, Europe suddenly finds itself in a crisis of purpose. If the United States and Russia make peace, NATO becomes irrelevant. If NATO collapses, Europe is defenseless against any potential Russian aggression. If Washington prioritizes its relations with Moscow, then European influence in global politics disappears entirely. The sheer panic in European political circles is evident. Macron's desperate calls for an emergency EU meeting reveal just how terrified Europe is of its own weakness. The answer is simple. The Middle East is more profitable than Europe. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar are now the biggest financial investors in American industries. Middle Eastern energy markets are replacing Europe as America's preferred trading partners. The Gulf states are strategic hubs for US influence in both Asia and Africa. While Europe is busy begging Washington for security guarantees, the US is building stronger ties with Arab monarchies because money and energy matter more than old alliances. Europe is now irrelevant in Middle Eastern affairs despite centuries of colonial domination. Saudi Arabia no longer listens to Western powers. It negotiates directly with the US, China, and Russia. Qatar and the UAE have emerged as powerful diplomatic centers, sidelining European influence entirely. Europe is now neither militarily relevant nor economically attractive in the region. This marks the complete collapse of European geopolitical influence in one of its most historically significant spheres of control. By abandoning Europe, America is accelerating the rise of BRICS plus a coalition of emerging economies determined to challenge Western dominance. China, Russia, and the Global South now see America's declining support for Europe as a golden opportunity. The BRICS Plus alliance, which includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and new members like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, is now more powerful than ever. With America looking away from Europe, BRICS nations are expanding their influence in global trade, energy, and finance. Europe's historical crimes of colonialism, economic exploitation, and military aggression have left it with few real allies. Now, as the BRICS Plus nations rise, Europe is left weak, vulnerable, and despised by much of the world. The African Union is aligning with China and Russia, sidelining European influence in Africa. Latin American nations are rejecting Western neoliberal policies in favor of BRICS-led economic cooperation. The Middle East is shifting away from European trade partnerships in favor of BRICS-backed financial initiatives. Europe once ruled the world, but now it is weak, insignificant, and desperate for relevance. Europe is no longer a global power. It is a weak, declining, and desperate entity clinging to outdated alliances. The United States has abandoned its Western allies, choosing to prioritize relations with Russia, China, and the Middle East. BRICS Plus is rapidly rising, and Europe's influence is fading into irrelevance. The Western world order is crumbling, and a new multipolar system is emerging. The only question that remains is, how much longer can Europe pretend to be powerful before the world moves on entirely?